This is an ABC News special report. Now reporting, George Stephanopoulos.
Good morning. We are coming on the air because there has been a major train derailment south of Seattle, about 40 miles south of Seattle. Amtrak train 501 derailed in Washington State. You see that car right there. It is derailed right onto the Interstate 5, the main artery connecting California to Washington State. Traffic has been stopped in both directions. This is a major incident. I want to go straight to our correspondent, Matt Gutman, on the phone. Matt, what do we know?
George, we know that it seems to be a significant incident, as you mentioned. Local affiliates showing numerous ambulances and medical personnel rushing to the scene. As you mentioned, I-5 continues to be shut down, certainly in the southbound lane. And these images we see of this train car, at least one dangling over this bridge, are certainly concerning. Now, the Pierce County Sheriff says they are rushing to the scene. There are many personnel there trying to tend to the wounded. There are casualties. And in addition to that picture we see of that one car dangling over the overpass, there are other cars that appear to be derailed. Unclear where the injuries are, George, or the significance of these casualties at this event.
There were 75 people on the car, we were told. And I want to go to our transportation correspondent, David Curley, as well. And David, this was the inaugural run of Amtrak 501?
Yeah, this is a very popular route, George, along the corridor, basically. I-5 and Amtrak kind of run this north-south route between Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland. A lot of traffic in this area, and it's unclear. This is supposedly a new locomotive. I'm not sure if it's the inaugural trip, George. And it's clear at this point whether this train potentially derailed by itself or did it hit something. And we've seen crashes like that in the past where at a crossing, a train has run into a truck or a vehicle crossing that crossing. We've also seen speed be an issue in the Philadelphia accident. So very early to know exactly what has happened with this Amtrak train. But to see a car like that hanging over the bridge onto one of the busiest pieces of interstate in the Northwest is quite dramatic.
Yeah, traffic now backed up 3 miles in either direction. And David, as you say, this is a major, major artery.
Yes, and most of the traffic in that part of our country in the Northwest is this north-south corridor of I-5, the trains that are going to go either all the way down into California, up into Vancouver, BC. This is the lifeline along the West Coast.
This was a train that left Seattle around 6 a.m. Apparently the incident happened around 8:01. Matt Gutman, emergency responders reporting to the scene now?
Absolutely, in enormous numbers, George, and we see them streaming in there, ambulance after ambulance. They're having to navigate and weave through this massive traffic jam that has built up that's already miles long. We understand that they are already at the scene. I assume that they're doing triage, but as you and David mentioned, not only is the I-5 corridor, which goes all the way from the border of Mexico and San Diego to the border of Canada, one of the busiest routes, but this is one of the busiest times, right during rush hour traffic on a busy work day, maybe people heading for holiday vacations. So it was the intersection of a major rail route and the primary interstate road route in the Northwest. So a tremendous number of people in a confluence of all these people at one time. So I imagine it's going to be very difficult for law enforcement and for medical personnel to get there. And we're seeing some new images coming across now. There do appear to be medical personnel tending to what seem to be wounded, or at least working on some wreckage down on I-5. Working on the debris from where that train seems to be dangling off the overpass. So we see people both above the train track, which is above the I-5 interstate, and on the interstate itself. So this is a significant event. There are dozens of ambulances already moving to the scene, and many, many personnel trying to figure out, A, what's wrong, and then, of course, tend to the wounded as well.
And David Curley, several incidents with trains over the past couple of years, sometimes operator error, sometimes problems with the equipment, speed regulators.
Absolutely, George. And if this is a new train, what's going to be really interesting, and it's a little early to be talking about this when we still have first responders on the scene, but in the Philadelphia derailment, that deadly accident because the engineer was driving too fast on a curve, that derailment and the deformation and how the cars broke apart were lessons learned for Amtrak and for regulators that the the rail cars that we are traveling in and Amtrak don't always stand up to these high-impact accidents. I don't know what kind of cars this train was carrying and rolling down the rails, but that's going to be something. Did we learn our lesson from Philadelphia several years ago? Have these cars been improved? Are they the new models or still some of the older ones that we saw in Philadelphia as well?
And David, explain what kind of impact this will have on train travel across the Northwest at this time of year.
Oh, it's going to be very, very problematic. It will depend on how much damage were done to the rails, because you'd be surprised at how quickly these rail workers and rail companies can deal with an accident like this. I mean, once again, we're still dealing with those who are potentially injured in these cars. But once they clear that scene, they'll be able to clear that train out of there pretty quickly. If there's not serious damage to the rails, the artery could be opened up fairly quickly. If there is serious damage, that's problematic. And as most people know, when you're traveling on these main arteries of rail lines, there are often 2 or 3 sets. Can they move some of the traffic over? But it's going to be a concern, as Matt has mentioned. We're getting to the peak season, and hundreds and thousands of people travel home for the holidays on Amtrak along that north-south route.
And Matt, we see that car just hanging over off the overpass there, right on to the highway. Do we have any idea the numbers on the overall train, whether cars slammed in to any part of the train?
It's hard to tell at this point, George. There does seem to be some debris on the roadway, and I cannot tell at this point whether it is vehicles or buses, but it actually looks like one of the rail cars actually careered off the tracks and landed in the I-5 roadway. It appears to be significantly damaged, perhaps even having flipped over once it landed, and you see medical personnel and first responders working on that. This seems to be a very significant crash, and whatever happened to have derailed this train, I think that is going to come second to first figuring out how many people have been hurt and whisking them off to safety and to evacuate them to hospital if that's possible at this point. Clearly, medical personnel are there. The sheriff's is on it. They have already set up a media staging point, so they're starting to create a perimeter and take control of the situation. But unclear right now how many people have been affected, but it certainly seems like this is a mass casualty event, George.
And David, the National Transportation Safety Board will take the lead on this investigation?
They've already told us they are gathering information, and undoubtedly they will be launching a team to investigate this. And, George, the official statement from Amtrak is that it is aware of the incident involving Train 501, Cascade Service, which was running from Seattle to Portland. It says it has reports of some injuries reported and that service is temporarily suspended, all things we've been talking about. But it seems to be more serious than this statement may suggest. TSB, this will be a year-long investigation, but the answers that will come out of this investigation all aimed at preventing something like this from happening again.
And the incidents we've dealt with most recently have been on the East Coast. Is it the first major one on the West Coast?
There have been some elsewhere along the West Coast, and some of the more like metro-type regional carriers have had some issues as well. Rail traffic's still considerably safe. It's safer to get on a train than it is to drive around in your car, George.
And Matt Gutman, I haven't seen anything come across our wires to indicate this. Is there any sense at all that there was any incident on the train that precipitated this? Do we have anything like that?
We do not have anything like that at this point, George. All we can say is describe essentially what we see and repeat what officials are telling us, that they are on the scene. Again, dozens of ambulances there. It does seem to be a very significant crash. I mean, the pictures that we are seeing right now is of at least that one rail car that is dangling off the overpass, another that has seemed to have crashed beneath it, flipped over. There are first responders there on the scene. There are ladders on the top leading to the top of that flipped over rail car. One of the things that distinguishes the East Coast from the West Coast is that on the West Coast there is a little bit less rail traffic for personnel. There's a tremendous amount of cargo, oil, chemicals that are moved around and transported on rail. But the East Coast, and especially that Northeast corridor, is really where the bulk of people travel on rail day to day, especially on Amtrak. So this Cascades line is something that is not as frequently traveled, but still we assume that there were many, many people on board this train when it derailed. And again, this seems like a very significant incident. Hard to get direct images right now. We're just starting to get some of those new images. You see the cars lined up, flashers there. They're intermingled with first responders rushing to the scene. You can see that the cars have moved off to the side to try to create a pathway for first responders to get through that tremendous amount of traffic. Again, this is I-5 during rush hour, one of the busiest roadways in the Pacific Northwest, a major corridor leading all the way from the border with Mexico to the border with Canada, and we're right near Tacoma, Washington, and Seattle. So tremendous amount of traffic there. One
of the things we can see, David Curley, on the side of that car that's dangling off the overpass is Amtrak Cascades. What does that tell you?
That's the service, this Cascade service. It runs from Vancouver, BC, down through Seattle, Portland, and then it goes over to a couple of other cities in Oregon. And the Cascade Mountains, of course, run north-south there, and so they run on the west side of the Cascades Mountain. George, you know, it is way too early to talk about what actually caused this. As I mentioned earlier, could it have been something at a crossing that we're not seeing back or forward from the bridge where we're seeing that car hang over I-5, or was it something that happened with the train going too fast, or was it something with the rails? And so far, federal officials are telling us they have no indication that this could be terrorism related. But I have to tell you, just a couple of weeks ago, we did a story about the fact that in the latest Inspire magazine, which comes from Al-Qaeda, the cover story was suggesting that would-be terrorists consider trying to derail trains. Once again, federal authorities say they have no indication of this. But it is something that local authorities, federal authorities, Amtrak, and the freight rail people are concerned about. And we have a couple of 100,000 miles of rail line across this country. Much of it is unsecured, and it's a problem that they're looking at.
Okay, David, thanks. I want to bring in now Greg Mukai from Washington State on the phone. And Greg, tell me where you were. You drove by about 50 feet from this?
Yeah, so I was on my way to work, and 50 feet prior to going under the overpasses, everybody on the freeway came to a sudden stop, trying to avoid colliding into one another. Once we all stopped, we looked up and realized that the train had come off the tracks, so off the overpass onto the freeway, hanging there, and lots of folks, including a lot of good military personnel, ran to try to give help before emergency personnel arrived.
So you didn't see the train come down? By the time you saw what had happened, the train was down?
Right. I mean, we were so focused on not trying to run into one another because everybody came to a sudden stop from 60 down to 0, you know. But when we looked up, smoke everywhere, everybody was curious what happened.
And could you see if there were passengers on that car that was hanging off the bridge?
From where I was, no. There's no way to see if anybody was in it. Honestly, it's the first time I've ever seen a passenger train on that track. It runs parallel to I-5 going south there. So it was kind of a surprise to see it in the first place. You can't see anybody. There was nobody coming out of the train after the incident.
And you didn't hear anything before the train came down either?
No, I didn't hear anything.
How abruptly did this all happen? How abruptly did you have to stop?
It was slamming on the brakes. We were all slamming on the brakes and swerving to the side of the road to try to avoid one another. I mean, it's wet and it's windy here in Washington today, so it was pretty abrupt.
And as far as you can tell, were there any traffic accidents in addition to what happened with the train?
No, not from just normal traffic or anybody trying to stop. I think everybody, they acted pretty well to avoid one another. But like I said, the train did appear to come in contact with some vehicles on the actual freeway. So.
And you said you saw some military responders and other people rush quickly to the scene. What exactly were they doing?
There were folks who they looked like they just got done with, their physical morning thing. They were all in that attire, and they were just people probably heading home. But they were grabbing anything they could, towels, clothes from their car, first aid kits to try to help. I did my best to stay out of the way. I'm not skilled in that manner, and I would just probably be a pain. So.
And you say they were bringing out all the equipment. Did you see any injured on the ground?
I didn't see any injured from my vantage point when I first got there. As I was, stuck in traffic due to the emergency vehicles, they were bringing folks out on stretchers and backboards to try to transport them out of there.
So you definitely did see people who were injured and maybe seriously being taken from the scene.
Absolutely.
And where are you now?
They turned us back around. I'm heading home. I'm on my hands-free device, behaving myself. But yeah, they allowed us to get out of there, mostly probably because they needed space.
Okay, well, Greg, thank you very much. It's important information we have right there. I want to go back to David Curley. David, one of the things we're learning from the Washington State Department of Transportation is that the train was running down a new bypass created to avoid slow curves. Do we have any idea about how fast the train was going?
Yes, we've just been able to confirm that from Amtrak's real-time tracking of this train that it was traveling at 81 miles an hour, which is, depending on the piece of track, is not necessarily speeding or going over the limit. So that.
What speed do they generally travel at?
It depends on because these tracks, we built these tracks a long time ago, and because they do have curves. At times, you've seen it if you've done the Acela on the East Coast anywhere. There are times they have to slow down because of curves. If they have a straight line, they can go up to 80, 90, or 100 miles an hour on a fast train. So 81 miles an hour doesn't necessarily suggest it was going too fast at the time. And let me just add one more thing, George. You mentioned the Cascades, and you can see that on side of the Amtrak rail car. And the coloring and the paint scheme there is actually hearkening back, and I'm using some of my old-time little model train. Those are the colors that were used for trains in the Pacific Northwest 100 years ago, 80, 90 years ago. So this is kind of a throwback of this service that runs along the Cascades on the west side between Portland, other Oregon cities, and all the way up to Vancouver, BC.
Yeah, it was a train running from Seattle to Portland, left Seattle around 6 a.m. Pacific time, was scheduled to arrive in Portland around 9 a.m. Pacific time. This incident happened, we're told, right around 8 a.m. I want to bring in Pierre Thomas, our senior justice correspondent in Washington right now. Pierre, we know the National Transportation Safety Board is already investigating. Has the FBI, any other law enforcement authorities in Washington picked up any more information?
So far, we have no word the FBI is involved. But, George, in cases like this, it's not unusual when there is no clear cause immediately known for the FBI to assist the NTSB in trying to find out what particularly happened. I can tell you, because of the level of this kind of event, the federal authorities, Homeland Security, FBI, will be very curious as to know what happened, and they will offer support, George. But
no indication yet that this was anything other than an accident? No indication that it was terrorism related or deliberately inspired?
That is correct, George. Nothing to that end that we can report at this point. We will continue to check with our sources throughout the morning. Nothing to indicate that, but again, law enforcement officials will be available to assist if needed. Again, we have a major train derailment. You see it right there. It happened in Washington State around 8:01 Pacific time this morning. Train running from Seattle to Portland, Amtrak 501. And you see that car dangling off the overpass into the highway, the I-5 highway. Traffic backed up in both directions right now. We know there are casualties. We know there are significant injuries being taken from the scene. Emergency responders on the scene as well. We're going to track this all day long here at ABC News. There'll be a full report tonight on World News with David Muir. And you can get breaking news alerts anytime by downloading the ABC News app. We'll stay on this all day. I'm George Stephanopoulos.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.